Princess Beatrice and Eugenie expose the royal family, the palace scandal they were never supposed to reveal. Welcome to B News. What happens when two royal sisters decide they've had enough of being silenced by the crown? On December 1, 2025, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie made a decision that would send shockwaves through Buckingham Palace, a decision that challenges everything we thought we knew about royal protocol, family loyalty, and the future of the British monarchy. Behind the gilded gates and carefully orchestrated public appearances, a battle has been raging for years, and now, the York sisters are finally ready to tell their side of the story. But before we dive into this explosive revelation, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what you're about to discover will change how you see the royal family forever. And if you think you know everything about royal drama, think again. Drop a like on this video if you're ready for the truth, and let's get started. The relationship between Princess Beatrice, Princess Eugenie, and the institution of the crown has always been complicated, wrapped in layers of tradition, expectation, and unspoken rules. For decades, these two women have walked a tightrope between being members of one of the world's most famous families and being completely excluded from its inner circle of power. They are granddaughters of Queen Elizabeth II, daughters of Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, and yet they've never been considered working royals in the traditional sense. They've attended the weddings, worn the tiaras, and smiled for the cameras, but behind those carefully composed photographs lies a story of frustration, rejection, and ultimately, rebellion. What we're witnessing in December 2025 isn't just a family squabble, it's a fundamental challenge to how the monarchy operates, who gets to benefit from royal privilege, and what happens when those on the outside decide they're no longer willing to play by the rules that have kept them marginalized. The tensions between Beatrice, Eugenie, and the crown didn't emerge overnight. They've been building for years, rooted in decisions made long before either sister could have influenced their own destinies. When Prince Andrew married Sarah Ferguson in 1986, there was hope that their children would occupy important positions within the royal hierarchy. Beatrice was born in 1988, followed by Eugenie in 1990, and initially, there seemed to be every indication that they would follow the path of their cousins, Prince William and Prince Harry, as full-time working members of the royal family. However, as the years passed and the monarchy began its process of modernization and streamlining, the York princesses found themselves increasingly pushed to the periphery. The turning point came in the early 2000s when discussions began about reducing the number of working royals and the financial burden they represented to British taxpayers. Beatrice and Eugenie, despite their royal titles and bloodline, were deemed non-essential to the core mission of the crown. This decision, made by palace advisors and senior royals, would set the stage for decades of resentment and confusion about their roles within the family. What made this situation particularly painful for the sisters was the inconsistency in how they were treated. They were expected to maintain the dignity and decorum of royalty, to represent the family at certain events, and to conduct themselves according to strict protocols, yet they received none of the financial support or official recognition that came with being working royals. While their cousins had offices, staff, and clearly defined duties funded by the sovereign grant, Beatrice and Eugenie had to forge their own career paths in the private sector while simultaneously managing the complications that came with being princesses. They couldn't simply blend into ordinary life, their every move was scrutinized by the media, their relationships dissected in tabloids, and their fashion choices analyzed by royal watchers worldwide. Yet when they sought support or guidance from the institution, they were often met with indifference or outright dismissal. This double standard created a unique form of suffering. They bore all the burdens of royalty with few of its privileges, caught in a liminal space between the commoners they could never truly become and the working royals they were never allowed to be. The situation deteriorated further as scandals surrounding their father, Prince Andrew, began to dominate headlines. The allegations connecting him to Jeffrey Epstein and the subsequent legal battles cast a dark shadow over the entire York family. For Beatrice and Eugenie, this period was devastating on multiple levels. Not only were they dealing with the personal pain of watching their father's reputation crumble, but they also found themselves further isolated by the institution. The palace's response was to distance itself from Andrew as much as possible, and by extension, his daughters found themselves even more marginalized. Invitations to key events became fewer. Their presence at royal gatherings was downplayed. The message was clear: the York princesses were an embarrassment, a liability that the crown would rather forget. What the palace didn't anticipate was that this treatment would eventually push Beatrice and Eugenie past their breaking point, transforming them from compliant, quiet family members into women willing to challenge the very system that had rejected them. Throughout 2024 and into 2025, those close to the sisters began noticing subtle shifts in their behavior and public statements. Eugenie, in particular, became more vocal about issues of fairness, transparency, and the need for institutions to evolve with the times. While she never directly criticized the royal family, her choice of causes and the language she used in interviews suggested someone who was increasingly frustrated with outdated hierarchies and double standards. Beatrice, typically more reserved, also began making choices that raised eyebrows within palace circles. She accepted positions and partnerships that, while perfectly legitimate, demonstrated a willingness to operate independently of royal approval. The sisters were building their own brands, their own networks, and their own narratives, all outside the control of the crown's communications team. This independence was unprecedented for royals of their generation and proximity to the throne, and it made the senior royals extremely nervous. The breaking point came in November 2025, just weeks ago, during what should have been a routine family gathering. According to sources close to the situation, Beatrice and Eugenie requested a private meeting with senior members of the royal family to discuss their roles, their father's situation, and what they perceived as years of mistreatment. The meeting, which was supposed to be a diplomatic conversation about finding a path forward, reportedly devolved into a heated confrontation. The sisters came prepared with specific examples of how they'd been excluded, marginalized, and used by the institution when convenient, only to be discarded when they were perceived as problematic. They raised questions about financial arrangements, about why their security had been reduced despite ongoing threats, and about the hypocrisy of a family that preached unity while systematically excluding certain members. The response from the senior royals was reportedly dismissive and condescending, suggesting that Beatrice and Eugenie should be grateful for the privileges they did have and should accept their peripheral status without complaint. This response was the final straw. The sisters left that meeting having made a decision: if the crown wouldn't acknowledge their concerns privately, they would find other ways to make their voices heard. What happened next was carefully calculated and brilliantly executed. Rather than going to the tabloids with their grievances, which would have been easy to dismiss as attention-seeking behavior, Beatrice and Eugenie began a series of strategic moves designed to highlight the issues they cared about while subtly undermining the palace's narrative control. Eugenie gave an in-depth interview to a respected international publication in which she discussed her work on anti-slavery initiatives, but wove into the conversation pointed observations about power structures, accountability, and the importance of questioning authority. Beatrice accepted a high-profile role with a technology company known for its transparency and progressive values, and in her acceptance speech, emphasized themes of meritocracy and equal treatment. These weren't direct attacks on the royal family, but anyone paying attention could read between the lines. The sisters were building a counter-narrative, one that positioned them as modern, ethical, and forward-thinking in contrast to an institution they viewed as archaic and unjust. The palace's response was predictable but ultimately ineffective. Anonymous briefings to royal correspondents suggested that the sisters were ungrateful, that they didn't understand the complexities of royal life, and that their complaints were exaggerated. But this strategy, which had worked effectively to control narratives in the past, was less successful in 2025. The media landscape had changed, and public sentiment toward the monarchy was more skeptical than it had been in decades. Many people, particularly younger generations, saw Beatrice and Eugenie as sympathetic figures, women who had been born into circumstances beyond their control and were now being punished for the sins of their father while receiving none of the support given to other royals. Social media amplified the sisters' message, with hashtags supporting them trending across multiple platforms. Commentators began asking uncomfortable questions about the fairness of a system that could treat family members so disparately, and about whether the monarchy's approach to modernization was genuine or merely cosmetic. The situation escalated dramatically in the final days of November 2025 when a close friend of the sisters spoke to a major news outlet, revealing details about the confrontational family meeting and the years of tension that had preceded it. While the friend insisted they were speaking without the sisters' knowledge or approval, few believed this claim. The level of detail provided, the strategic timing, and the careful framing of the narrative all suggested coordination. The friend described emotional scenes in which Beatrice and Eugenie had begged for understanding and support, only to be met with cold indifference from family members who viewed them as inconvenient reminders of past scandals. The friend revealed that the sisters had proposed multiple compromises over the years, asking for limited roles, offering to work without payment, requesting simply to be acknowledged as legitimate members of the family, all of which had been rejected. The portrait that emerged was of two women who had tried everything to belong, to contribute, and to be valued, only to be consistently rebuffed by an institution more concerned with optics and hierarchy than with family bonds or human decency. As December 2025 began, the standoff between the York sisters and the Crown entered a new and uncertain phase. The palace found itself in a difficult position. Acknowledging the sisters' complaints would require admitting to years of unfair treatment and potentially opening the door to reforms that would challenge the fundamental structure of royal hierarchy. But ignoring the situation was no longer viable, as public attention had reached a critical mass. The sisters, for their part, seemed prepared to continue their campaign of strategic revelation and independence, comfortable with the role of royal rebels and apparently unafraid of whatever consequences might follow. They had spent their entire lives trying to please an institution that never truly accepted them, and having finally broken free from that need for approval, they had discovered a power that the Crown couldn't easily counter, the power of truth, authenticity, and the willingness to walk away from a system that no longer served them. The implications of this conflict extend far beyond two individual princesses and their grievances. What Beatrice and Eugenie are challenging is the entire model of how the modern monarchy operates, who benefits from it, and at what cost. For generations, the royal family has maintained its position through carefully managed public relations, the mystique of tradition, and an implicit bargain with the British people. In exchange for privilege and wealth, the royals would dedicate their lives to service and duty. But what happens when that bargain is revealed to be inconsistently applied, when some family members receive all the benefits with few of the obligations, while others bear all the burdens with none of the support? The York sisters are asking these questions not just on their own behalf, but on behalf of anyone who has ever felt excluded, undervalued, or exploited by institutions that claim to represent higher principles while practicing favoritism and hypocrisy. Their battle is, in many ways, a microcosm of larger societal debates about privilege, accountability, and the extent to which we should continue supporting hierarchical systems simply because they're traditional. Looking at the historical context makes the current situation even more fascinating. The British monarchy has survived for over 1,000 years by demonstrating remarkable adaptability, knowing when to reform and when to stand firm. The Crown weathered the abdication crisis of 1936, adjusted to the end of empire in the mid-20th century, survived the Diana years and their aftermath, and more recently has had to contend with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's departure and allegations. Each crisis forced evolution, however reluctant. The question now is whether the institution has learned from these past challenges or whether it will repeat the mistakes that led to previous ruptures. The early signs are not encouraging. The response to Beatrice and Eugenie's concerns appears to follow the same playbook that ultimately failed with Harry and Meghan: dismiss the complaints, brief against the complainants, hope that time and royal mystique will restore the status quo. But this strategy has diminishing returns, and with each iteration, the monarchy loses credibility and public support, particularly among the demographics it most needs to secure its long-term future. There's also a gender dimension to this conflict that cannot be ignored. Throughout royal history, women have frequently been the ones sacrificed for the greater good of the institution. They've been expected to subordinate their own needs, desires, and voices to maintain family harmony and public image. Princess Margaret lived much of her life in frustrated obscurity after being denied the marriage she wanted. Princess Anne, despite being hardworking and competent, was never given the prominence or resources allocated to her brothers. Diana, of course, paid the ultimate price when the machinery of the crown turned against her. And now we see this pattern repeating with a new generation. Beatrice and Eugenie are expected to accept marginalization gracefully, to absorb the impact of their father's scandals without complaint, to maintain royal dignity without royal support, all because they had the misfortune of being born female into a family that, despite public statements about equality, continues to operate on deeply patriarchal principles. Their rebellion is not just against their specific mistreatment but against centuries of systemic sexism within the institution. The financial aspects of this conflict also deserve careful examination. The royal family's relationship with money has always been controversial, a constant tension between their image as public servants and the reality of their immense private wealth. Working royals receive funding from the sovereign grant, which is derived from public funds, ostensibly to support them in carrying out their official duties. But Beatrice and Eugenie, despite having royal titles and being expected to uphold royal standards, have never received this support. They've had to earn their own money through private sector jobs while simultaneously dealing with the complications that come from being royals, the security concerns, the media attention, the restrictions on what types of work they can pursue without causing controversy. This creates an impossible situation. They're too royal to live as ordinary citizens but not royal enough to receive institutional support. The inequity becomes even more glaring when one considers that other members of the family, who are further from the direct line of succession, do receive support simply because they were designated as working royals early on. The sisters are essentially asking, what is the principle that determines who receives support and who doesn't, and is that principle fair and consistently applied? The palace has never provided a satisfactory answer. The public reaction to this unfolding drama has been fascinating and revealing. Traditional monarchists have largely sided with the institution, arguing that Beatrice and Eugenie should simply accept their lot in life, that they still benefit enormously from their royal status, and that publicly airing family grievances is inappropriate and disrespectful. But this perspective is increasingly being challenged by a broader cross-section of society that views the situation through a different lens. Many people see the sisters as sympathetic figures dealing with an unfair system, and their willingness to speak out, however indirectly, is viewed as courageous rather than disloyal. Social media has been particularly supportive, with countless threads analyzing the various ways the sisters have been mistreated and comparing their situation to similar dynamics in non-royal families where certain children are favored while others are scapegoated. The discussion has moved beyond the specifics of this particular case to broader questions about family dynamics, institutional fairness, and the extent to which tradition should be preserved when it produces unjust outcomes. International observers have also weighed in, often with less reverence for the British monarchy than domestic commentators feel obligated to show. Royal families in other European countries have watched this drama unfold with interest, seeing in it lessons for their own institutions. Some have pointed out that the Scandinavian monarchies streamlined their operations years ago and have clear, consistent policies about which family members receive support and which titles children will carry, avoiding precisely the sort of ambiguity and perceived unfairness that has created the current British crisis. The Spanish royal family, having dealt with its own corruption scandals, has been ruthless in distancing itself from problematic members but has also been more financially transparent than the British Crown. The comparison is unflattering for Buckingham Palace, suggesting that what Beatrice and Eugenie are demanding, clarity, fairness, consistency, is not unreasonable but rather represents basic organizational principles that other monarchies have already adopted. The question is why the British institution, which prides itself on being the model for other royal families, has been so resistant to these reforms. One of the most intriguing aspects of this conflict is what it reveals about the current leadership of the royal family and their vision for its future. King Charles III has long advocated for